YugiNoNo!
Okay, so since my GOAT format video was very well liked, I have decided to make a video on a few other legacy Yu-Gi-Oh formats. I will be getting to Teledad as requested, but only after I refresh my memory on some things. This video is going to be an introduction to Yugi-Kaiba format, which was the first legal TCG format. It's probably the perfect format for Duel Link players to start out with as well because of its simplicity in comparison to modern Yu-Gi-Oh! This is a format that I greatly enjoy playing with my friends, and it actually can be technical even though it is essentially just a beatdown format. I'm going to explain relevant cards, tactics, and decks to get you prepared for fun times playing some old school Yu-Gi-Oh! So let's start with the time frame. Yugi-Kaiba format, or May 2002 format, lasted from May 1st, 2002 until June 26, 2002, which was the release date for Metal Raiders. Metal Raiders introduced us to cards like Mirror Force that greatly changed the game, so cards from that set are not included even though the May limited list was in effect until July. What we now know as the Forbidden and Limited list was then just known as the Limited list because there were actually no cards banned at the time. And the Limited list was as follows. For our limited monster cards, we have Exodia the Forbidden One and all of his limbs. For limited magic cards, we have Change of Heart, Dark Hole, Monster Reborn, Pot of Greed, and Raigeki. For our semi-limited magic cards, we have Card Destruction and Swords of Revealing Light. And there were no traps on this list. Back in the day, spell cards were known as magic cards until a certain legal dispute happened, but that's something for another video. The card pool for this format is very small. There were only 3 sets out at the time, and those sets were Legend of Blue Eyes, Starter Deck Yugi, and Starter Deck Kaiba. This actually makes the format funner in its own way. Now, just like in my GOAT video, one has to remember original rules and card text, but luckily this format is simple enough that I don't have to explain too much this time around. Priority was not a thing in Yu-Gi-Oh yet, so the only rule that applies here is drawing on your first turn. So both players starting with 6 cards instead of the player going first starting with just 5. Technically, the player going first has the advantage, but it doesn't have as much of an impact in this format as it does in GOAT format. The only card text that you have to remember for this format is Last Will. Last Will has to be activated before your monster goes to the graveyard, instead of the change that Konami did later where it could be activated after. This doesn't make the card totally useless, but it's not as powerful as its current card text. Okay, so now that we've gone over the limited list, legal sets, and rules, let's talk about staple cards. For the spells, we have the Power 5, which were Change of Heart, Dark Hole, Monster Reborn, Pot of Greed, and Raigeki. These cards are still some of the most powerful spell cards of all time. In this format, they all have their uses when it comes to strategy. It is very important to keep track of which cards your opponent uses in this format. For example, if your opponent hasn't used their Raigeki and or Dark Hole yet, and you overcommit monsters to the board, you will lose a lot of card advantage. The format is all about 1-for-1 trade-offs, but Raigeki and Dark Hole can win you games against an overly eager opponent. Now, you want to use Change of Heart for one of 2 things. You want to activate it and take your opponent's monster and tribute it for Summon Skull, or if your opponent doesn't have any card set, for example, you want to take an opponent's monster and just swing openly for game. And Monster Reborn, you really wanted to save for Summon Skull, but you can also use it for an extra summon for La Jin, for example, and swing for game. The other staple spells were Card Destruction, Swords of Revealing Light, Fissure, which was at 3 and it was a very useful card, and lastly for Blue Eyes, Flute of Summoning Dragon is also a staple. Swords of Revealing Light is important for 2 reasons. 1, it could prematurely flip up an opponent's Man-Eater Bug or Trap Master, and 2, it just keeps you alive and allows you to stall. Card Destruction was important because it was the only other card besides Pot of Greed that lets you see more cards from your deck. Card Destruction was very format defining because it forced players to set spells like Monster Reborn that they didn't want to lose. Which brings us to D-Spell. D-Spell is not only a counter to Swords of Revealing Light, but can also be used to snipe out your opponent's set spells. For other relevant spells, we have Soul Exchange, Last Will, and Stop Defense. Soul Exchange can be used to tribute an opponent's monster for Summon Skull, for example, and some players choose to play Last Will as a defense against Trap Hole and Man-Eater Bug. Last Will is also justifiable because it's the only thing that can deck thin this format. And lastly, Stop Defense has the same use as Swords of Revealing Light against Man-Eater Bug, forcing it to flip up and destroy itself if there are no other monsters on the field. There were many other spells available at the time, but they were mostly equip or burn cards and aren't as practical to use. Next up, we have the staple traps, which were Reinforcements, Trap Hole, and Wabaku. Reinforcements helps cards like Neo beat over La Jin, for example. Trap Hole prevented La Jin and Summon Skull from being on the field, and Wabaku lets you not only stay alive, but lets you suicide a monster and still keep it. Other relevant traps are Just Desserts and Ultimate Offering. Ultimate Offering is iffy, but Just Desserts can be a pretty nifty tech card. So now, getting to the monsters, we have your main beat sticks, which were La Jin, Battle Ox, and Neo. These are your main beat sticks because they are the biggest level 4 monsters available at the time. And of course, if you're playing the Yugi deck, you play Summon Skull. And that is because it only costs 1 tribute and it's 2500 attack. Then we have Maneater Bug and Trap Master for your destruction monsters. Maneater Bug and Trap Master might be your most important monsters, even more so maybe than La Jin. Maneater Bug can literally kill anything from La Jin to Summon Skull, Neo, Wall of Illusion, Giant Soldier of Stone. I mean, literally anything that's in your way, this card can get rid of. And Trap Master can snipe out your opponent's trap holes with ease, which was very good. And they can also both lead to a +1 if your opponent doesn't attack into them. And card advantage is very tight and very important in this format, and these cards just really help with that. And then we have your walls, which vary from player to player, but typically people play Wall of Illusion because of its effect, or Soldier of Stone because of its attack. However, some choose to play Mystical Elf because it slips under trap hole if she's normal summoned. Now for Blue Eyes, most of the card choices will be more or less the same, but of course you will add the 3 Blue Eyes White Dragons, and to turbo them onto the field, you play Lord of D, because Lord of D with the flute lets you special summon instead of tributing. And not only is not having to tribute good, but trap hole cannot stop a special summon. And 3000 attack is nothing to joke about. Players will usually also add a 4th dragon, being either Trihorn or Curse of Dragon. Other notable monsters are Spirit of the Harp and Aquamador, as they both have 2000 defense. And then we have the Stern Mystic, which is the maximum amount of attack for a last will target, which is 1500 attack, and it has a decent enough effect. And then we have Hain, which has a decent effect, and there's actually a combo I came up with using him. If you have Swords Up and Bug and Hain set, you can flip the Bug, pop an opponent's monster, then bounce the Bug with Hain and reset it. So you get 2 uses out of your Bug, which isn't horrible. Okay, now let's get to some decks and deck ideas. First we have the standard Summon Skull Beatdown or the Yugi deck, and the Blue Eyes or Kaiba deck. Both of these decks play a lot of the same cards because of the card pool at the time, but it also adds to the fun and standardization of the format. But the Yugi deck is the most popular and probably the better deck to use, as it is more consistent and has more room for tech card choices. I play 2 versions of the deck, the standard Yugi and the Last Will Yugi. But either way, the deck's main goal is just being a beatdown deck. It uses the standard monster lineup to poke away at your opponent, but it also plays plenty of defense cards. Then we have the Kaiba deck. This deck might be the funnest deck to play because summoning Blue Eyes is just an awesome feeling, and the 3000 attack can be just overwhelming for your opponent. This deck will play a ratio of either 2 Lord of D and 2 Flute, or will max out on both. Either way, the whole dragon lineup can hinder the consistency of the deck because it causes it to brick, but that's just kind of the trade-off for being able to get 3000 attack on the field. So those are the 2 main decks, and most players will choose to play the Yugi deck, but there's also room for creativity in the format. One could play something of a stall burn deck with the high defense monsters and burn cards available at the time. This one is just an example that I threw together, or you could play just pure stall and poke. Really, because the 2000 defense monsters are abundant, as are your removal cards. But a better deck might be one that I came up with, which is Soul Exchange Beatdown or Soul Beatdown. It maxes out on Summon Skull and Judge Man, and wins by tributing your opponent's monsters and beating them down. It's a fun deck idea, and it's more consistent than the Blue Eyes build for sure. And Soul Exchange is an awesome card to get around Wall of Illusion and pesky Maneater Bugs. Now, a deck that you can't really play is Exodia, and that's because card destruction was at 2, and basically everybody plays 2 card destruction. And there weren't any cards out at the time that could recover monsters from the graveyard, so if your opponent activated a card destruction against your Exodia deck, you basically auto lose. In my opinion, this format is just great. Even though it has a very small card pool, it adds to the fun of it all. This format also is made up of the most legendary and iconic cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! And it's literally called Yugi-Kaiba format, not because of the structure decks, but because of the decks themselves. It's literally Summon Skull versus Blue Eyes, which is awesome. Another great thing about this format is that it's dirt cheap. You could probably find all of these cards just laying around in your commons. But a lot of these cards do come in foil, so if you wanted to hollow out this deck for this format, you could. Like, you could play Legend of Blue Eyes Ultra Rare Monster Reborn, you could play Retro Pack 1 Super Rare La Jins, and of course Blue Eyes comes in many different rarities that you can choose from, and Wall of Illusion comes in a super as well, and Maneater Bug comes in a super. And you can play an Ultra Rare Summon Skull or a Secret Rare Summon Skull. And even hollowing out this deck in comparison to other decks is very cheap. The only roadblock that I came across when I was hollowing out my deck was finding Retro Pack La Jins. They are actually very hard to find. I hope this introduction gives you guys watching a good grasp on the format. This format is a lot more simple than GOAT, so I was able to get more in depth and explain how the format is played and not just go over card choices. This format is Yu-Gi-Oh! In its simplest form, and that's what makes it so fun to play, but it also has some technical aspects to it that I hope I was able to properly shed light on in this video. Alright guys, be sure to leave a comment down below and let let me know if you play this format. And as always, dick slap that like button and subscribe.